Jack Gough, welcome into the weeds, brother. It's fantastic to have you on. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your work with the Invasive Species Council of Australia. You're the advocacy rep for that organisation, doing
That's right.
great work. But look, tell me, mate, most people think that the world is going to be attacked by alien invaders from another galaxy. In actual fact, the reality is we're under siege from alien invaders from other continents, other places. There's species that are turning up in our ecosystems that shouldn't be there. And that's what you work on, isn't it, mate?
Yeah, good to be with you, Jez. People often think about some of the things that are destroying our environment. They think about, climate change. They think about habitat destruction, the over-extraction in our rivers. But actually in Australia, the number one driver of extinctions for our mammal species has been invasive species. And this is, those things that are not meant to be in the Australian environment, that when they get here, people often think rabbits, cane toads, they breed really fast. They get out into that environment really quickly. They adapt to that new environment. They often don't have some of those natural predators that they might have had back home. And that means that they can take over ecosystems, landscapes, cause enormous degradation, and really transform what Australia's environment is. And that's the sort of essence of our work at the Invasive Species Council, is saying, hang on, Australia is unique. Australia is this incredible continent that's been largely isolated from a lot of the world. It's got its own unique mammals. It's got, obviously marsupials, which for most of the world they don't have. It's had a long history of not being connected to other continents. We've got these incredible plants, animals, insects, and we are uniquely, compared to most places in the world, susceptible to invasive species because we're an island.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Australia's a continent, it's an island, but I'll take you back to what you were saying, that the invasive species that we've already had here have been the largest driver of some of our extinction. And Australia's got a terrible record when it comes to extinction of our fauna, doesn't it?
Oh, look!
Just to walk us through that.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible, and devastating record, and about 85% of all extinctions of our mammals have been caused by invasive species. Mainly, that's predators and pathogens, so things that eat other species, and it's diseases that turn up. So people might have heard of like the chytrid fungus that's come and some of our.
I don't think they have, mate. Tell us about the chytrid fungus.
So
What's that?
People have. Might have seen those incredible little corroboree frogs, the yellow and black frogs that are up in the snowy mountains, and some of our zoos are doing some big programs to try and keep them alive. For frogs in Australia, the chytrid fungus, when it's turned up, has been one of the big drivers of their decline. It's a fungus from overseas that isn't in the environment in Australia that our frogs are really susceptible to, and we've seen really huge and rapid declines in those species. So, look, we know that there are an enormous number of invasive species in Australia.
Well, let's talk about that. Like, where did it start? Did it literally start at day one, as soon as Europeans turned up? Is that where it started? And just walk us through the history of invasive species in this country from that I suppose that first invasion.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot by accident. And there's a lot that was deliberate as well. So we know, from those first boats, there were rats that got into Australia. There were, rabbits, cats being brought that once people were getting off those boats, they were being introduced into the new environment. But actually, when it comes to, say, rabbits, it wasn't that initial rabbits that were on those boats that ever actually established themselves in the wild. It took, decades and decades until someone actually brought a particular European wild rabbit population in that they wanted to be able to, make their parkland look more like Europe. And those rabbits then were really able to quickly adapt to the Australian environment, get out there, and within a very short period of time, we had upwards of 1 billion rabbits covering this continent that we never actually got on top of until there was a biological control in the form of both myxomatosis and calicivirus that dropped those numbers down. So
Because that really turned into a full bore plague, didn't it? Like in the 20s and 30s, it was just a huge plague of rabbits, a massive population explosion, degradation of the environment, and like a really significant soil loss and impact on the ecosystem.
yeah, I mean, rabbits, I think with some of our species now, at least 350 of our plants and animals that are on the brink of extinction, rabbits are a major driver still. But yeah, in the 40s, we were eating 25 to 30 million rabbits a year in Australia, and it made absolutely no difference to that population because it was so big. They spread so quickly. They took over. I think, rabbits in Australia are well documented as the fastest invasion of a species into a new area ever. The speed at which the speed which they took over the entire Australian continent, and one of the things we've been working on a lot recently with governments has been feral deer, which it's not quite the pace of rabbits, but within the last 2 decades have gone from about 200,000 deer, mainly in Victoria and parts of southeast New South Wales, to now probably over 2 million deer in those 2 decades. And what we know is the 6 species of deer that we have at the moment, if governments aren't serious about investing in, the aerial control, the regular strategic suppression of those numbers, will spread across the entire continent. They'll be up in the Kimberley. They'll be up in Kakadu. They'll be down in southwest WA in not much time at all. And that sort of window to stop them being that next rabbit plague across the whole of Australia is really rapidly closing.
Well, I'm keen to talk about the current threats, but let's keep talking a bit about like our legacy, like how we haven't done things right in the past. Because like with rabbits, like I know that the South Sydney Football Club are called the Rabbitohs based on the fact that their community used to have a person coming through selling rabbits. And so and that was a part of their survival and sustenance. During the Depression, people lived on rabbits, so they quickly spread. They were quickly sort of integrated themselves into the environment at massive cost. And so, for some of our viewers who might not be Australian, or what are some other disasters? Like, what about the cane toad? I mean, it's a in Australia, it's a cultural icon. Queenslanders, the cane toads. But tell us about how the cane toad came to be.
Yeah, so look, that's a really classic one. It's sort of one of those ones where...
Because that was by design, wasn't it? Like someone thought it was a good idea to get a South American toad.
There was a cane beetle that was causing a whole heap of issues in sugarcane up in Queensland. And then there was an idea that, well, if you go back to the native range of that cane beetle, which is also an invader, that they were eaten by these cane toads. And so if we just brought those toads in, wouldn't that be great? We wouldn't have any cane beetles. And actually, we give out our sort of top award every year that we give out to, who does, governments and industry and others and individuals who do something really significant on invasive species, is called the Froggatt Award. And it's the Froggatt Award after a guy, Mr. or maybe Dr. Froggatt, who essentially was the only scientist at the time. He wrote this paper saying, wrong way, go back, this thing's going to take over, it's going to be a disaster, don't do it. Wasn't listened to at the time. The Queensland government with the CSIRO decided to bring in the cane toad. It took over and has rapidly spread, and it's been a pretty significant environmental threat. It's not, up there with rabbits and deer and fire ants and some of those diseases that I talked about. It certainly has an impact, and we've started to see some adaptation of Australian species in terms of how they, because the way that they would die is they've got a poison sac on the cane toad, and if you've got, a red-bellied black snake or a crow or something coming and eating that cane toad, they get that poison, they die. There's evidence that they're starting to work out ways.
I've heard that they some of the crows or raptors are flipping the toad over and just eating their guts out, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
But that's taken a long time, and the toad's gone from Queensland. Like it's in the territory now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the main thing that restricts its movement is climate and access to water. So there is actually a program now looking at, can we stop cane toads getting down through WA? And really that's about working with landholders, some of the pastoralists there, to make sure that their water points, because that you've got this desert out there, that their water points aren't basically the way that cane toads can hitch their way down the WA coast, and so looking at ways to either fit those water points with mesh that stops the cane toads being able to get in and have babies, or also looking at actually switching off some of those water points. So the rapid spread of cane toads is definitely the classic example. But right now in Queensland, we're facing another disaster, which is going to make the cane toad look like absolutely nothing.
I know you
in
want to
terms
talk
of
about fire ants. We'll get to fire ants because they are alien invaders. Like they are a freak show. But let's keep talking a little bit about Australia's just abysmal history when it comes to invasive species, because we've got others. Like Australia, people don't think of horses as an invasive species, yet I think there were more horses in Australia at the turn of last century, like what we call the whaler, the horse, than anywhere else in the world. There was like a gigantic population of wild horses in this country that were like domesticated horses that had escaped, flourished, and became gigantic herds. And we're still dealing with that legacy, aren't we, in terms of what we call brumbies and their impact in some of our most sensitive environments. Like, I love national parks, love going out for a walk, the Snowy Mountains, Mount Kosciuszko, one of the most important, iconic natural ecosystems in Australia, but it's really under threat from that legacy of those wild horses that were introduced hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, so Australian continent, we don't have any native hard-hoofed herbivores. So, the heaviest animal in Australia in terms of our native animals is male red kangaroo, about 95 kilos they get up to. The females are about 45 to 50 kilos. They're the second biggest. Everything else is less than that. 500, 600, 700 kilo horses with hard hooves, heavy grazing pressure. What they do is they trash, they trample, they pollute, particularly in sensitive alpine areas. You've got those peat bogs. You've got certainly up in the Snowy Mountains, pre-Europeans coming, the biggest grazing pressure came from insects, and now we've turned it around. So the biggest grazing pressure now comes from deer, horses, pigs. In terms,
and this is an alpine environment where it's slow growing. What impacts are felt, over years and decades. If trees are destroyed, they don't necessarily grow back, or take generations to grow back.
Yeah, this is an area that is the basically it is the sponge for the Murray-Darling Basin. So over 30% of the water in the Murray-Darling Basin comes from the Snowy Mountains. It's the headwaters of the Murrumbidgee, of the Murray River, of the Snowy River, and it's being trashed, trampled, and polluted by feral horses. There's at last count, there's about 18,000 feral horses up there, which is an incredible load. If you think on top of that, there's also feral deer increasingly moving into that area. There's pigs causing damage. And what it means is you get those, those alpine peat bogs that take thousands, tens of thousands of years to develop, being cut up, and then they start to drain. And the implications for our farmers are huge for that, because this is the sponge. You imagine all that snow melt. The snow's up there and it melts, and it could really quickly just run away down our river systems, out to the Murray mouth. But these peat mosses actually hold that water and slowly release it across the season. You get horses coming in there, these large, heavy animals, heavy grazing pressure, but particularly with those hard hooves, and they cut it up and it starts to drain away. So that's a real problem. I mean, I know our Indigenous ambassador, Richard Swain, he talks about the Murrumbidgee doesn't get 2 centimetres out of the ground before it's trashed, before it's stomped on, before it's pushed back in by those horses.
But there's some cultural pushback because there's a cultural affinity with the Brumbies. There's the man from Snowy River, that mythology about those pioneers up in those alpine areas and taming those wild horses and the rest. How are you dealing with that? How are you dealing with that pushback from those people who say, well, now they're sort of part of the landscape. We should just allow them to roam free and manage it rather than, I think, I think you're arguing for, is to eradicate them and to prioritise the native environment, the native ecosystem. How are you dealing with it?
Look, we're putting to the Australian public, to politicians, that we do have a choice to make. We can either have the roof of Australia, that iconic national park, the Snowy Mountains, turn into a degraded horse paddock, basically. And we've got enough of them in Australia.
The Snowy is like our only by there's not a lot. So we don't have a lot of mountains in Australia.
Yeah.
And by most standards, they're hardly even mountains. So how high is
2228.
2228. They're hills in New Zealand. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of alpine areas. It's a really relatively small area, super sensitive. So you're saying that the Australian population has a choice to make about whether or not they protect that very small, fragile area or convert it into other areas which we...
we've got enough horses and enough horse paddocks in Australia. That's not something we lack, but what we don't have much of is these really sensitive alpine areas that people can go and walk and see, that heathland, those peat bogs, those, forests that are those alpine forests that are there. And also, with climate change, we're increasingly seeing, as places warm, species having to move up those slopes to find refugia, areas that they can live that aren't too warm. We're seeing fire damaging that ecosystem as well. So this is one threat that we can easily get rid of. We've got the techniques. We know horses, their population goes up at about 18% a year. Aerial control can be done safely, humanely, by professionals, and we can actually eradicate that population and have it as that native wilderness that I think the majority of Australians want. But it is a choice. I'm really pleased that most political parties have made that choice. They understand the issue, and I think most Australians do. But there is this opposition, and I put that opposition in. There's sort of 3 camps with that opposition. It's not, a uniform group, but they are definitely a minority. There's sort of one group which is probably the most active and often the most, violent, to be honest, in their rhetoric. They can be pretty dumping horse heads and sending threats to firebomb national park staff and things like that.
Yeah, that's happened, hasn't it?
That's happened.
There's been some essentially terrorism around this. Death threats, horse heads. That's outrageous, isn't it?
Yeah, no, look, we've had death threats. Ministers have had death threats. Park staff have had death threats. Park staff don't go often. They won't wear their uniform in parts of the community because their kids get harassed and things. So there's a one group, and really that group are associated with the old mountain cattlemen. So their grandparents used to have cattle leases up in that area. There was a decision, we can't have cattle trashing and trampling this area. It is basically degrading. It's, the soil is being stripped away. This needs to become a national park. And there's still a resentment around that. These groups, they want to see cattle back in that environment. That's the main aim. And the way we often talk about it is, for them, they want to see that horse out there as the avatar of dominance in the landscape. Knowing, something is still out there, proving that they're out there, dominating that landscape in it, and so that's one group. They're pretty full on. Another group, which is quite interesting and can be pretty full on, is actually, it's mainly middle-aged women who were really into the Silver Brumbies series or really loved Russell Crowe in the Man from Snowy River movies and have this sort of emotional attachment to the idea of these beautiful horses being out there, as if that is the only way that nature can be. that's what nature is for this little group of people, which is, I think, unfortunate because we have lots of places where horses can run wild, lots of other parts of the world you've got horses running wild, and there's no lack of horses. And then the third group,
I just got to say, I've got to correct you there. I think it was Tom Burlinson,
what was Tom Burlinson?
the man from Snowy River.
Okay.
Number 1 and 2, Tom Burlinson. I had a bit of a cultural attachment, and I think it was, I can't remember who the actress was that was in it as well. Sigrid Thornton, I think it was.
There you go.
Yeah. Like I was caught up, like I went, yeah, hey, this is a bit of Australian heritage, but, we got to recognise things change, we got to move on.
My kids love Spirit. I mean, sometimes I think our job is, there's a lot more to it, but part of it is like we're having to say to the Australian public, there are circumstances where Spirit and Bambi and maybe Garfield have to be killed, and that's a difficult thing. No one likes to see animals killed. This isn't something nice. It's not something positive that we're out there that they have to be killed, but it is a choice. And, making that choice early is really important as well. And one of the groups that I really struggle the most with is there's a sort of a third group, which are more the animal, sort of extreme animal rights groups that don't want to see any animal killed in any circumstance by humans.
Yep.
They sort of, and that group really sees that, it's okay for, masses of brumbies or feral horses to die in drought conditions when their population
break
is to
their leg and stagger around.
Yeah, it's okay that they're sending some of our native species extinct as long as humans don't have any sort of positive intervention to kill an animal. So that's a real philosophical position, and actually, I find that group the most reasonable and the most sort of civil in dealing with. Like, it's a real philosophical position. It's not necessarily about the horses. They also don't want to see feral cats killed. They also don't want to see, action taken on deer for that same reason.
They want non-lethal, like sterilisation and things like that. But is that feasible? Is it really feasible? I mean, we're talking about incredible, vast areas, incredibly remote, and like the measures they're suggesting are incredibly expensive too.
Yeah,
and is it true that there's really only one option, that is shooting these animals in the most humane way possible?
Yeah, and doing it, the earlier you do it, the less animals you actually have to kill. Because I think some people tend to think that, these populations are static. They grow. So if you choose not to take action, the number that then you have to kill actually goes up. And if we had taken action when the numbers of horses in Kosciuszko National Park was 800 and removed 800, we wouldn't have to be removing 8,000 a year over multiple years now to get it back down. So, but look, in terms of fertility control, the reality is it only works in a population which is geographically confined, small, where you can identify every single animal, where and the other thing, and the Animal Justice Party's submission to a recent Senate inquiry on this actually spelt it out themselves, which is it'll take 3 to 5 years once you start that for the population to stop growing, and then about 20 years till it starts declining, because horses are long-lived animals. So we're then baking in 25 years of significant damage by making that decision to go with fertility control, but also it's simply not possible in an area like Kosciuszko. They do it in the US in New Zealand, where they've got really confined, essentially horses in paddocks, with fences where they can then tag all those horses. But the other option that people talk about is often rehoming. There just isn't the demand. There aren't people who want to take them, and unfortunately, there's huge welfare implications with rehoming too. You imagine.
And these are wild animals.
These are wild animals.
These are wild animals.
You have to.
Never been.
They have to be, mustered, captured, confined, transported. Then they've never been domesticated. They have to be broken, obviously. Sent to people who often don't have the experience in managing these horses. So, the majority of horses that get captured for rehoming go to the knackery after that whole process, because no one wants them. Because just like with, we see with cats and dogs, people who want to rehome a Brumby, They want it to be the right color, the right size, the right condition, even sometimes the right lineage or coming from the right area of the mountain. And so, yeah, it's just not feasible. I mean, and if you go like the US, where they've got feral horse populations, their Mustangs, and they had a law actually brought in federally in the 1960s that said I think it's called Wild Horse Annie, I think her name was, that she got up, that basically says you can't kill the wild horses. And now there are literally tens of thousands of these wild horses just sitting in holding pens for their whole life because no one is allowed to kill them. No one wants to take them. They will pay people $2,000 if you'll take one. No one wants them.
So they don't have a culling program in the States for their Mustangs.
No, they've got this federal law, which, no one, as you can see, US is pretty dysfunctional in changing any laws. And yeah, basically since the 60s, no one's allowed to, and they spend millions and millions of dollars trying to manage an out-of-control population that people move to Arizona and they think, oh, wow, check out these horses, and then quickly realize, hang on, they're taking over our towns, and no one can do anything about it.
So because of the science and I suppose your advocacy, we don't have that situation in Australia. And in New South Wales, we've got a government that's pretty proactive now in that feral horse control. How's that going?
Look, I'm super pleased. Like the Minns government came in, they've made it a priority to get on top of the numbers. They've worked really collaboratively also, though, with the Liberals, with the Greens, with yourself, I know, to make sure that there's broad support for it. They've invested the money that's required, and for the first time in 20 years, the numbers of feral horses in Kosciuszko National Park are actually going down. So we're getting above that 18 to 20% growth rate, and now we can be confident that those numbers are reducing, the impacts are then reducing, and that's really positive. But we still have a weird law in New South Wales that was brought in by the former Deputy Premier John Barilaro, and at the time that was coming in, we spoke to many people across all sides of politics, including in his own party, and couldn't identify a single other politician who thought it was a good idea. But because of the way politics works, it got passed. He got his law up, which says that feral horses still have to be protected in a national park at the expense of our native species. And so there's this idea that we're going to keep 3,000 feral horses up there, which is still way too much. It will still trash, trample, and pollute the place, and will also mean we're going to be locking in a huge amount of taxpayer dollars forever for something that, eradicating pigs, not possible. With our current tools. Eradicating cats and foxes, not possible. Deer, in some circumstances, it is possible. Horses, pretty easy. Big, they tend to be in open landscapes, a slower reproductive rate. You can get rid of them. And that's what the government's now actually doing in the Gondwana rainforest up around Barrington Tops and in the Blue Mountains. Now that they are starting to do some work in Kosciuszko, there's a confidence to do it in those areas, and they're just getting rid of them. They're not mucking around. But they're still, because of this law, mucking around in Kosciuszko National Park with 3,000 horses that will just keep trashing and trampling the place.
So you alluded to then some of the animals that are like wild pigs, cats, like domestic dogs that are out in the landscape, deer. A lot of these animals, when we're just going to have to manage rather than we're never going to eliminate them without some sort of biological control. Let's just go through a couple of them. Camels, wild camels. Like, people think of camels and they think about, the Arabian desert, trucking over some sand dunes. In Australia, we have huge populations.
The biggest in the world.
The biggest in the world. Like, we are, camel central, and they're bad hombres, aren't they? I've seen video of towns out in Central Australia being overrun by camels. They're just perfectly adapted to the, of course, the arid environment, and they're getting big and they're getting mean. Apparently, like I read that, a big, bull camel in Saudi Arabia goes for big money, really big money in camel racing, and the best place to get them is in Australia. How bad are camels in Australia, and where did they come from? Because they've been here for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these species that came in were actually through what we called acclimatization societies. So these were societies that were actually set up dedicated to introducing species to Australia to make it look more like other parts of the world. And so actually one of the interesting things you find is that there's a lot more feral animal problems in southeast Australia and a lot more weed problems in Queensland and Northern Australia. I mean, you've got both problems in both areas, but partly because just the different acclimatization societies down here, they were trying to introduce all the hunting resources. Let's get the deer and the foxes and the rabbits into the landscape. Whereas in Queensland, they were trying to introduce all these different plants that would suddenly take off. And obviously bringing in some European plant from a temperate environment, some of them got into the subtropical or tropical environments and just went, happy days. Let's get out there and take over. But camels, look, they are what's called a key threatening process. So there's a number of things that have been acknowledged as, you know, these these species, or, you know, things like, you know, altered fire regimes or habitat destruction are some of the main ways that some of our native animals and plants are going extinct. I think part of the issue with camels also was the introduction of paddy melons, those little, not the animal paddy melons, but actually I think must be paddy after Irish people, I'm not sure, but like little melons that basically also, as an invasive species, took over the desert and meant there's this constant source of water for them to be able to access, and they can spread in a large way. But the thing that I find really frustrating about camels, and which I think sums up a lot of the way that governments have approached invasive species, is that in, I think, around 2008, 2009, Peter Garrett said enough is enough, invested a huge amount of taxpayers' money into absolutely, you know, hammering that camel population, getting it right down. The response then afterwards from governments has been, oh, do nothing. Basically, oh, hopefully we'll set up a market to sell them to Saudi Arabia, or maybe there'll be a meat market, or maybe there'll be a carbon market, or something will get set up. Do nothing for the last 15 years. So that population in the millions is now back up, right up to where it was 15 years ago, when we could have kept it at a low level, reduced that impact in those semi-arid and arid environments where really, you know, having these huge herbivores with massive grazing pressure that are able to eat some of our, those native grasses and other species right down, stop regeneration occurring, influence erosion. We could have really got on top of that problem and held it low. Governments just basically
where are we up
walked
to?
away.
Are there tens of millions of them?
I don't know the exact number of camels off the top of my head.
I saw some Birds Australia. We're just talking about the impact of camels. Like Australia has incredible diversity of bird life, but one of the key threatening processes is camels in this huge area. We're talking an area, you know, like the size of, like, you know, probably like Western Europe. It's a huge area. Arid Australia, these great deserts,
The rangelands,
these huge ecosystems, and the camels are having a devastating impact in terms of stopping regeneration. So, like, say there's every few years there's a rain event, there's a regeneration of the vegetation, but that's smashed by the camels, the wild horses,
goats.
the goats, donkeys. It really is a massive issue. One of the control measures that's put out there is aerial culling, helicopters out there, and people are critical of that. You know, that we would send people out there, that it's inhumane and all the rest. What's your view on aerial culling when it comes to brumbies, camels, horses, pigs?
Look, it's the most effective way to rapidly reduce these populations. I mean, there's baiting as well, but bait options aren't really available for deer and camels and things in the way that they are for pigs. And obviously large-scale baiting of pigs is also used. But look, I think the reality is that often these objections come from people who don't actually want to see the animals killed, which is fair. Like, no one wants to see animals killed. That's a really difficult thing. And it's actually, I think, it's a good thing that people feel uncomfortable about killing animals. And one of the criticisms that we often have is that there is a lot of government programs out there for feral animal control that make no difference and essentially just go out there and say, you know, here's the press release, we killed 100,000 animals, even though there was 5 million and their growth rates, 80% a year. So made no difference. But yay, we killed them. So we don't think that
they do that with poisoning, don't they? So the government will there doesn't seem to be. I find it funny. There's no pushback when it comes to poisoning animals. They poison a lot of animals with 1080 poison. It's this thing called 1080, and they lay these baits for dogs, foxes, pigs, and that's a horrendous way to die. Like I personally would rather get shot in the head than, poison and stagger around for 3 days, slowly dehydrating. There's no pushback, but the 1080 poisoning program effectively doesn't really work, does it?
Look, it depends. Essentially, I mean, I think this is one of the things that we talk to governments a lot about is if you're going to do this work, do it right, and that means knowing, how many of that animal you've got in the landscape. What their growth rate is, making sure you target them at times when they're already suppressed. So in New South Wales, for example, the New South Wales government has this $13 million pig shooting program, which I've said publicly a number of times is basically a joke. The Natural Resources Commission last year came out and said is the textbook example of what not to do. Because essentially it's this 1 year pulse of money because some farmers are annoyed that the pig numbers are up because we had really good conditions. Spread it around the whole landscape, just shoot pigs and bait them wherever they are without any of that strategy, without saying, okay, here's where numbers are low, we're going to keep them low. It's going to cost us more per pig, but we can actually keep them out of this area. Or it's a drought right now. So during the drought, we're going to go really hard because we know nature's doing a lot of our job for us and we can actually mop up some of the other ones. And then when you get those good conditions, and everyone can imagine, if you've got a growth, if they're doubling every year, say, if you've got 100 or you've got 1,000 and you've got 2 years of good conditions, you're going to be at 400 or you're going to be at 4,000 after those 2 years. It's a massive difference. So targeting them at the right time matters if we're going to have good, feral animal programs. And look, aerial shooting the Kosciuszko feral horse program is probably the most monitored, feral animal control program in the world, and the RSPCA, the independent vets, haven't found a single welfare concern around how it takes place. Yes, animals die though. And so there is no, there's no easy way of saying that. We're not, there are animals that are going to die, and so that is a welfare issue. The problem is if you let those populations get out of control, if you don't deal with them effectively, either you have to then kill a whole heap more animals than you otherwise would have, or you're accepting that the native animals are going to have to die there, are going to have to decline and probably go extinct, some of them, So it's a trade-off. It's a difficult trade-off. I'm not pretending that it's something that's easy. I'm actually pleased that parts of society are uncomfortable. We need, it has to be held to account on these things. But we also sometimes have to be a bit hard-headed. This is a choice. It's a choice that's important. Aerial culling has really good protocols. It's really effective. It allows you to, make sure with camels and horses in particular, these animals, once you've shot one, if you're, a ground shooter, they then disperse. If you did, unfortunately, shoot it in the leg, that thing's going over the mountain. You're never getting it back, and it's probably having a horrendous death. If you're aerial shooting, if there were mistakes, which they found in that Kosciuszko program, there basically aren't, you can really quickly make sure that you find that animal, put it out of its misery. So difficult, important work though.
But I'm glad you've raised the issue of ground shooting, because often in this debate, there's a part of our community, the hunting lobby. In Australia, we've got the political party. They're represented, sort of like they're the
Shooters Party.
Yeah, the Shooters Party, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. They're sort of our NRA light, I suppose. They're representatives, but they are interestingly, they're against a lot of these control measures for some of the species, and particularly deer. And they say, look, that their job as hunters is to manage these populations. but there's sort of a duality in sort of their purpose because they want to hunt, so they don't want the deer to disappear. Yet they're saying that their job, it will be help to be out there to help eradicate it. So, what's your view on that, and also this issue of bounties? Often it's put out there. If we offer a bounty of $100 a head on this animal, that animal, well, that will control the animal. Do bounties work, and are hunters going to fix the problem?
Yeah, and the other one that's the ABC have a program at the moment called Eat the Problem with Tony Armstrong, and that's the same sort of idea, and it sounds really appealing.
Well, that one's like, let's eat cane toads, or let's eat feral species,
Exactly.
invasive species. Let's eat them out into oblivion. But it's just
it's unfortunately a fantasy. It doesn't work. Look, there's a few things to unpack there, Jez. I mean, I know you did a lot of work to try and get feral deer declared as a pest in New South Wales, and we had this ridiculous situation where feral deer were protected as a hunting resource, as they continue to be in Victoria and Tasmania. And the shooting lobby essentially wants it to stay that way because effective landscape scale control when it comes to deer, they know, can actually knock those populations down really significantly. And the cynicism of the shooting lobby is that they know that if you get deer into an area and you ensure that governments don't take effective action for, depending on what that initial population is, but 3, 5, 8 years, it'll get above that number where eradication is possible, and those deer will be there forever. And then that basically that recreational pursuit they can continue to do it. I mean, there's no lack of deer, but there seems to be this sort of fundamentalist idea that deer or pigs should be everywhere. I mean, you look in South Australia, for example, they don't have feral pigs really. I mean, they've found some recently in the Flinders Ranges. But every year or two, they find feral pigs, which then they trace those DNA, and it seems to come somehow from, hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away in New South Wales or Victoria, and essentially has been transported there by hunters. So it's an
that
issue.
allegation has been made about deer too, hasn't it?
Oh.
That people are translocating deer for hunting opportunities, and we're seeing, like across Australia, a massive spread of sambar and red deer. Not part of our
Chital.
Yeah, all these species of deer across huge landscapes.
Yeah, look, and it's there is an active lobby trying to stop effective control. So, for example, in New South Wales, in basically all of our state forests, there is no aerial shooting that takes place because they're the dedicated sort of hunting parks, and there's a bit of a fantasy idea that, the hunters will keep on top of those populations. But what we know is actually state forests in New South Wales have become the place where feral animals are harboured, where they get out into landholders' properties, where they get out into national parks. They cause all that damage because no one is properly keeping the population in check, because aerial shooting doesn't take place because of the political power, essentially, of the hunting lobby.
And the hunting is just ad hoc. It's not strategic, and ultimately they're trying to maintain populations. They're not shooting young deer, and they're not shooting like what are they called, foals or bambies or whatever they are.
Well, often they are. I guess they're shooting stags, but what's found with the bounty program, for example, in Victoria, is nearly all the foxes that are shot under that program are actually young foxes, because they're the most naive. They're the foxes that are actually the easiest to get. But about 80% of those foxes would have died before they got to adulthood anyway. Often what is targeted is the easiest ones, the females. They're the ones that are left. So, there's a lot of discussion that you hear if you talk to people about goat exports through Broken Hill, that they just happen to be mainly nanny goats and not billy goats, despite the fact that people who are harvesting them are meant to round up all the goats, and it's illegal once you've rounded up a goat to re-release them, but they just happen to be majority billy goats, not nanny goats, because let's get the nanny goats back in. And this is really to that heart of the issue around a bounty, or that sort of eat the problem idea, is that we all know what humans are like. If there's a free lunch, we're going to take it. right? And there's a lot of people, like, as soon as, you put set up a market for these things, either by, it being like a market to, sell the meat from that product, or a bounty where you're going to get some money for it, then the incentive really is to make sure that they stay in the landscape. We see fraud being absolutely synonymous with bounties. People, in Victoria, I think they found lots of the time that some of the offices where the tails of the foxes are being handed over for the money then get broken into, and the tails all get taken away and then get given to other areas. So
what do you get for a fox in Victoria?
it was 10 and they've gone up to $14 for a fox. So and this is something that certainly there's proposals for New South Wales to do, but everywhere it's been trialled in Australia, bounties have failed. They've failed because of human nature. They sound good on paper, but the reality is that you create a very active lobby that is opposed to getting rid of that species that is essentially rent-seeking. You create an incentive to keep them in the landscape, but also it lets governments off the hook for effective control, which is the real problem here, is that, it stops those other effective, strategic, long-term programs starting because...
And dare I say it, they're expensive.
Oh.
They're expensive, but, what cost of, losing even more of our flora and fauna in Australia to invasive species? So that's the key question. And at the moment, there's... we see explosions in deer population spreading. They're becoming a risk not only to the native flora and fauna, but also to human health because they're a vector for disease. They're turning up on roads.
Seeds.
Seeds, spreading weed seeds. They're an impact on agriculture. They're a vector for disease. So the costs are enormous. The cost of dealing it is significant, but at some point we're going to have to bite the bullet, or we'll end up in the situation we now have with goats. Like goats in Australia, I've been out west and you just drive along and there's just gigantic herds of hundreds, if not thousands of goats.
Yeah, I think they went from about 200,000 to 5 million from 99 to 2019.
How many?
5 million.
5 million goats.
Yeah.
I met a farmer
over 20
and
years.
he... because there was money in goat meat, export, rounding up feral goats, sending them to Russia and Afghanistan. And
I think I know the farmer.
Yeah, I think I know the farmer too. I won't name him here, but apparently he had 250,000 or 50,000. Anyway, tens of thousands of goats that were worth, tens of dollars a head. He just had this Yahtzee moment where he just went, oh my God, I've got, a couple of $1 million worth of goats on this huge property. But do farmers really want to wipe out that income stream and get rid of all of those breeding animals? Probably not, you'd say?
No, and I think, the reality for a lot of farmers has been that they're making a decision between going into sort of carbon farming or goats out in western, rangelands areas. You can't increase the level of carbon in your landscape and have goats. They don't work together, but cows do.
Goats will eat anything, won't they? I saw a goat once eat a towel.
Yeah,
a towel hanging on a line. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever.
I feel like that's like in every kid's cartoon book. Get the goat pulling the knickers off the line. So.
I saw a goat. We had an Angora goat that was we had to keep down blackberries and hawthorn. It's just amazing to see a goat eat hawthorn. It's like a plant with this, it's like a nail. It's super hard. The goat just chews it down, whatever. They'll eat whatever, and they're just denuding the landscape.
Yeah.
They really are. There's another animal I want to talk about because, with a lot of these environmental issues, and it's the big things, it's the black rhino, it's the pandas that get the attention in terms of it's the fluffy animals.
We call them the charismatic species.
The charismatic species. That's exactly right. So what is not charismatic is a fire ant.
Oh.
So fire ants, and I started off by saying like alien invasion. Like, what are some of the small nasties that are coming into Australia? Well, it's a global issue, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
It like really is a global issue because a lot of this is being facilitated by global trade, boats turning up in ports.
And as trade goes up, then the numbers of these things turning up go up in a big way.
Go up. That's how it's being
And
facilitated.
we had big problems with COVID. With suddenly all these cars got left in yards overseas for a year or two. So when they were turning up to Australia, suddenly they've got a lot more soil on them. They've got a lot more. So that's been a big issue recently.
Well, let's talk about the little things because
Yeah.
we've talked about the big things. What are some of the small nasties we're getting here? And let's start with fire ants because that is truly, apocalyptic. They're nasty. You've been bitten by a fire ant. Tell me about that.
Bitten and stung, actually.
Is it bitten and stung?
So the way the fire ant nests work, right? If you and so the fire ants are all in southeast Queensland at the moment, and there's an active eradication program because they really are, one of the worst invasive species around the world.
Where did they come from?
South America. So
South
these
America.
are sort of an Amazonian ant that when there's floodwaters, they form these rafts where they can like float down floodwaters in mass balls of ants essentially, and in those Amazonian environments, there's fish that have evolved to essentially eat fire ants while they're rafting. There's other ant species that outcompete them, but they're hyper aggressive because in that South American environment, there's a huge diversity of ant species. They're competing for, in rainforest environments for pretty limited resources because rainforests are turning over those nutrients so quickly because of the level of rainfall. And so there's a lot of things that they're having to compete with, and so they're hyper aggressive. They're really quick to spread, but they're kept in check. But then they actually got into the US, and it'd be good to chat maybe a bit more of that. Maybe I'll explain what they're like first, because the global environment movement in terms of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a large part of that book is actually in response to how the US dealt with fire ants. So that sort of response to DDT and things was because basically the US was so worried about fire ants that they just dropped DDT and basically tried to nuke the entire South,
So
which
that was
failed.
which was in the 60s. So
In
they
the 60s.
they developed DDT,
Yep.
this chemical, like it's just a chemical nuke for like life,
Yes,
essentially.
exactly.
And that led to like bioaccumulation.
Yeah.
DDT turned up in little things that were eaten by big things, and then we had like basically bald eagles
Yeah.
disappeared.
And people
because the apex predator, the toxins bioaccumulated into through the food chain into your apex predator. America went, oh, we've got a problem. Rachel Carson.
Humans are good apex predators.
Yeah, we are too. It turned up in us too. Like we've got DDT in us.
Yeah. So that that was
That was a response to fire ants. I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, that was fire ants, and it was they didn't have like the sort of the chemicals and the contact poisons that we've got now that actually are much more targeted and effective, and I can talk to that. But yeah, that was the Rachel Carson Silent Spring that a lot of people sort of attribute in the 60s to that environmental awakening came from the response to fire ants because they are so serious. But if you see a fire ant nest, and what normally happens with people is that you don't see it and you kneel on it or you step on it with bare feet or you put your hand down on this nest and it's just basically a little mound that's on top of the grass that won't have any holes in it because
I've sat on a jack jumper nest in Tasmania, like the black Tasmanian jack jumper ant.
Yeah.
I've sat on one of those bushwalking or
Yeah.
whatever I was doing as a kid, sat down and just had my ass just attacked by those, and I think I nearly went into like shock.
Oh man, and
Bad.
yeah, and like one of the big
And
problems.
they're nowhere near as toxic.
Well, they don't have the same rates of anaphylaxis, but also they don't have the same density. This is the thing with fire ants. Is like I've been to horse paddocks in Queensland just in December last year with the new ag minister there, where you are seeing hundreds of nests in these single paddocks, right? So you can imagine how they take over backyards. And what happened in the US is people start pouring petrol on their yards, using chemicals off-label, doing anything they can to stop it. Because, I put my hand in a nest, you disturb that the top of the soil, and they boil out of the ground. Basically, they instantly all boil out the ground. They come straight up you. They all bite and then start stinging with the back end. They keep stinging till they run out of poison, and they all do it at once, and they don't stop. So my whole arm was covered in welts, basically all the way up. It's like
Come on, I've got to ask you, Jack. Did you do it deliberately?
Yeah, I did. I did. And actually, it's like my...
Have you got video of that?
I do have video of that. I'll give it to you.
Send us the video.
I'll send you the video.
We'll put the video up of you getting smashed. What happened to you?
So, you get covered in these welts, and it's basically each one feels a bit like a paper cut. So it's like not that bad individually. Overall, there's lots of swearing as it was happening and trying to hold my hand still. They're not that hard to get off, but you can imagine if you were a little kid, or you're like someone who's in a nursing home,
an animal,
koalas, for example, they crawling along the ground, get into their faces. One of the ones that they're particularly worried about is echidnas and platypus, because they go down into the burrows where they have the babies, and the puggles get essentially eaten. But so not too hard to get off. And my experience was super painful, pretty painful, I'd say. Not super painful, but individually, paper cuts, but then it's a bit like having a really hardcore chili. I sort of wanted to do it again. Because, you're like, far out, that was hard. But then everywhere that it was on the flesh, it was okay. It took a week or so, but everywhere where it was on my knuckles, on my wrist, where the bones were, was just excruciating pain for a week. It took me a week to get my wedding ring back on. That's the swelling around my knuckles was so bad. And the problem with fire ants is the anaphylaxis rate is about 3 times that of bees. So people die from bees every year. If these get out, I think the Australian peak bodies for anaphylaxis and allergies have said that we could be having 750,000 extra medical appointments every year, tens of thousands of people having anaphylaxis, and, tens of people dying from it. In the US, there's horror stories. There's a story not too long ago of two boys on a football pitch tackled. They basically, no one had they hadn't probably got rid of all the fire ants, and this is one of the crazy things about them in the US. You have to, cities, sports clubs have to have people whose dedicated role is just dealing with fire ants. I think Austin.
So they didn't deal with them in the 60s, and they've spread across the US.
And then you're just dealing with them forever, and that's what will happen in Australia. And it'll be worse in Australia because in the US there's a line where they haven't gone north because of the temperature. It gets colder. But for Australia, essentially, other than parts of the Snowies where the horses are trashing it, and bits of Tasmania, everywhere is climatically, so 97 to 99% of Australia is climatically suitable for fire ants, whereas in the US, once you get above sort of the south, the American South, it starts to become too cold for them.
But they're it's costing them billions.
Oh, billions. And the estimate for Australia is $2 billion in economic impact every year if they spread. And that's not some theoretical, here's the economic modelling on the jobs or however coal mine companies do it. It's basically, this is the cost it will be to manage them, for the extra medical appointments that people are going to have, for the lost production. So, in Texas, they're seeing, 30-40% reductions in beef productivity because of fire ants, because they get into the mouth, the nose, the face, the ears of cattle.
That's a huge number.
They can they eat the roots out of crops, so huge reductions in production of grain crops as well. So this is why farming groups are really up in arms. But this is a problem for Australia, for Australian lifestyle. It's a massive issue for the environment. If this is one of those things that could tip species over the edge.
And so there's a beachhead of them, because it's come up in New South Wales and New South Wales Parliament last year, it was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
There was the first sort of outbreak of them in northern New South Wales.
Yep.
To the state to the north, Queensland, they've had a beachhead there for a couple of
20 years.
20 years,
Yep.
but they haven't been able to eradicate them. How serious are they about eradicating them, knocking this on the head?
So Australia's had a number of incursions of fire ants and a number of incursions of other serious ants, yellow crazy ants up in the north, Argentinian big-headed ants, like the whole heap of
Argentinian big heads.
Yeah,
Are they bad?
Norfolk Island. I mean, yeah, these are all serious impacts on
Yellow
environment.
crazy ants.
They spit acid in your eyes if you get them. They're all up in the Daintree, and they're looking to eradicate them up in there. And they're
Ants are
actually,
full on, aren't they, really?
yellow crazy ants are the reason that they saw that. I don't know if you know on Christmas Island, that crab migration. You see like all the crabs. So there's been massive declines because of yellow crazy ants getting in there, which is and essentially the damage that they do to those crab populations. But
No way.
a whole heap of and we're gonna because of global trade, we're gonna get these things coming in, and that's why we need vigilance. We need funding for that vigilance. But we've eradicated fire ants. They turned up in Botany. We've got rid of them. They turned up in Gladstone. We've got rid of them in Perth. We've got rid of them. It's actually the original outbreak, which was probably late 90s, early 2000s. It was first found in early 2000s, but probably had been there a bit before, that we haven't dealt with. And that's partly because the tools weren't really there, but also because governments essentially delayed their response, allowed them to get out. There's been sort of pulses of funding, and then government saying, we're starting to get on top of it. Let's drop that funding back down.
Are people getting hurt?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and they're I was just up in sort of southwest of Brisbane, where there's quite high infestation levels at the moment, and land care groups there talking about they're having to spend days ahead of doing planting just removing fire ants from areas. They can't take school groups out anymore because of all the deal they have to have with EpiPens and kids getting stung. People are having to train their dogs to recognise fire ant nests so that they're not there disturbing the nests and getting into the face of their dogs. I was talking to a farmer up there and his wife who was saying they basically because the densities are getting so high, they feel like they have to spend a couple of days before their grandkids come just making sure there's no fire ants anywhere around their house, so they feel comfortable their kids going out barefoot into the yard out there. Otherwise, their kids are going to get stung by them. And this huge, I mean, as I said earlier, that bit in me that it was a bit like, chili, and you want to have another crazy chili hit again. But I was actually at the fire ant eradication program with the chief scientist there, and they've got, in their tubs of fire ants that they're doing some, analysis of. And I was like, I'm going to stick my hand in and get stung again. And she was like, don't do that, because the level of your susceptibility to anaphylaxis actually increases the more and more you have this. So this is one of these issues.
Yeah, my wife, she's the same. She gets anaphylaxis from bees.
Yes.
And she's been stung, I think, half a dozen times in her life. And last time she was short of breath, had to go to hospital, EpiPen, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And they said you're getting close to the point where you could die. And when you walk along the beach, and there's I don't know why it is, seasonally or something happens where you walk along the sort of high water, the high tide line at the beach. Sometimes there'll be all these bees washed up, and she just trod on a bee, got stung on the bottom of the foot, had to rush her to hospital, the whole thing. So your susceptibility does go up. Well, so huge issue.
And to finish that story I was saying earlier, those two kids on the football field tackled themselves onto a fire ant nest. One was okay. One of them died.
Wow.
Just a young kid, but he got anaphylaxis, and was part of those people who respond that way. And this is the reality. A lot of the deaths in the US are from nursing homes, actually, from people, they go walking, they sort of trip on a fire ant nest and they're stuck there on it and they just get covered, or for young babies that are essentially the same thing where they can't move away. So
So what else is out there, mate? Come on, like, because it seems to me we spend so much money on like our defense forces, on like our military, and worried about apex predators being other humans, but really like a massive cost every year, every day to our economy, to our country, to our ecology, are invasive species. What else is out there that's nasty, bro?
And look, we have this weird issue where all the response sits in the ag department and the agriculture department, and the agriculture department's budgets are never that big, and so if you compare the cost, there's been about $1 billion spent on the fire ant eradication to the health budget, it's just like a drop in the ocean. You compare that to the agriculture budget, and it actually means that they're having to make tough decisions about programs.
We've spent $1 billion on the fire ants.
We haven't yet. So basically, Barnaby Joyce has been the champion on fire ants. So, if it wasn't for Barnaby Joyce, we probably wouldn't have kept up the eradication program. He put $411 million into that.
That's an astronomical cost for one species in one area. It shows just the cost of the
$2 billion a year is what happens if it gets out. Like it's nothing compared to that. And then since then, the federal government's just put another $596 million over the next 4 years into it, with states also contributing, and we probably should be doubling that to do it properly, and that's something we've been talking to governments about. But another one I'll tell you about, which isn't in Australia yet, that we're worried about and we've been working with governments on, is bird flu.
This is a big deal.
This is a serious deal.
We've talked about this, and bird flu, migratory birds, like it's... the impact on all kinds of fauna and humans could be absolutely astronomical, like in terms of our poultry industry. Walk us through bird flu, man.
Yeah, so, there's been lots of different bird flus circulating since the 90s. In Australia, we've had what's called low pathogenicity, or low pathogenity, I don't know. And we've had these and they're called the H7 strains, low. And just in terms of the speed of replication and how they spread.
They're not as contagious.
But, we spent sort of $100 million maybe in the last year with an outbreak of that H7 variety in some poultry farms in New South Wales and Victoria. So they can be pretty devastating, but they circulate.
And we see the pictures of that, and that's just the Department of Ag turning up and just killing all the birds.
Exactly. Millions of birds have to die.
Yeah, so it's like, if you're one of those birds, it's a big deal for you.
Yes. Yeah,
you've got a short life expectancy
and it's in our wild birds, and so it circulates, so every now and then it's going to turn up in poultry. This variety, though, it's called H5N1 clade 4332B. But
I believe you.
Yeah. It turned up in about 2021. In Europe, and has been absolutely devastating. It's spread around the world really quickly. Everywhere now except for Australia, New Zealand, essentially has had this new variety turn up. And to give you a sense of the numbers, in the UK, in those years, they lost 40% of their breeding seabirds, those terns, skuas, gannets, all dying. Like you see these rocky outcrops off Scotland, which were just, completely covered in birds. And then the next year, same photo, and it's sort of 30% covered in birds because there were just huge death rates. It spread into America, and now they're talking about in America, the death rates of their bald eagles are now back to where they were when DDT was an issue.
Wow.
It got into South America at the end of 2022, December 2023, sorry. 2022. Yeah, and spread through the entire continent in 6 months. And, Peru lost 40% of their pelicans. In southern Argentina, elephant seals, because often it's the actual predators like seals and eagles and things that eat birds that are infected get sick.
Are they eating dead birds?
They're eating dead birds. The elephant seals in 2022, the babies had a 1% death rate. In 2023, they had a 95% death rate. And now they're seeing basically colony collapses in, where did UK have their war?
Falklands.
In the Falklands, for example, in areas like this, we're seeing millions of birds dying around the world. And essentially Australia got a report in 2023 that said if it turns up in Australia, the consequences will be catastrophic risk level. The likelihood of turning up is medium to high, and catastrophic because it will cause local extinction. So they found, black swans, for example, which people love, are an icon of Australia, are particularly susceptible. So they in Europe, black swans in captivity in zoos that got it, 100% died within a few days. So it could send them locally extinct, for example. And Australia did nothing. Basically, it was just one more report that said, oh, this is a problem, we should do something. And we did a lot of campaigning, and actually at the end of last year, finally got the government to commit about $100 million to preparation, to essentially saying, what are we going to do if this turns up? What are we going to do to manage the carcasses? If we're seeing dead birds turning up on our beaches, what are we going to do to stop, tourism and recreational hunters disturbing colonies and seeing mass deaths? What are we going to do to start vaccinating some of the at-risk species? So in New Zealand, in America, in France, in South Africa with some of their penguins, they're already vaccinating species. We did nothing in Australia. Finally, we're starting to get that. And that's, these are some of the things that I guess keep us up at the Invasive Species Council up awake at night, rock snot and murder hornets and predator snails we can talk about as well. These things that are
rock snot.
Rock snot.
Rock snot.
It's exactly how it sounds.
No way.
Like, just imagine rocks, rivers covered in snot.
No way.
And
so just before we get on to rock snot and murder snails, how the going to stop? Excuse me, I can't swear. Just don't swear anymore, Jeremy. How are we going to stop? This is where we edit. Before we get on to that,
that's what you think.
Yeah. Before we get on to that, how are we going to stop a disease that comes on? Am I right? Migratory birds.
Yeah.
So birds that are moving from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere with the season. How do you stop
So there's
it?
probably three ways it could get in. One is those migratory birds. Another is potentially through ducks moving through Southeast Asia, but that'll be a lot slower. And then there's potential for it to come up through Antarctica because it got into Antarctica last year, and there's been Adelie penguin colonies, for example, collapsing in Antarctica.
So it's like Australia's essentially ringed by it.
Well, the Antarctica one is still on the South American side of Antarctica, and it's not clear how it would make its way all the way around, except that it may,
Yep.
And so we've got these three pathways. We won't be able to stop it, is the answer. And when it gets here, we won't be able to eradicate it. But what we can do is prepare to reduce the level of death and to make sure that species that are, going to be hyper vulnerable aren't sent extinct, So there's a whole heap of things that are involved in that. One of the species that we've been really talking to governments about has been the sea lions down on Kangaroo Island and in South Australia, critically endangered. There's only about 8,000 breeding adults left. You can imagine if you've got 8,000 breeding adults, if 60% of them died, we're talking then about potentially genetic collapse of that population such that it won't recover. But there are ways to prepare and reduce the death rate. So they found overseas, if you pick up carcasses, when you start seeing them dead and keep doing that, you can reduce the death rates by between sort of 15 and 80%. But that takes a huge workforce to start removing them.
To think about that in the context of Australia, the Australian coastline, when you think about like the Gulf
so this is why
Carpentaria,
we're going to have to pick winners.
Yeah.
We're going to have to go, what are we going to try and save? So the other one we've been
vulnerable population.
Another one we've been talking about has been Tassie devils, for example, because they're scavengers. They're going to start eating them. We know there's only a couple of islands where there's facial tumour-free populations of devils, because a lot of the devils have been wiped out on the mainland Tasmania. I know you don't want to call it the mainland, but yeah, on mainland Tasmania. And so places like I can't remember, the island starts with R, and Maria Island.
I went to Maria Island over summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was it. It's a refuge. It's a tiny...
Exactly.
It's a refuge.
And so then that's also an area that migratory birds turn up.
Yep.
So then, saying, okay, how are we going to stop devils eating those migratory birds dying. Other ones like the swift parrots and the yellow-bellied parrot, orange-bellied parrot, that...
And there's only a couple hundred of those birds left.
And so vaccinating them, that's something that's starting to happen to, and they're often captive bred populations in zoos that then get released. Looking at, for example, Abbott's booby, which is a bird in it's in the Indian Ocean, one of the Indian Ocean territories, where the entire population nests on one island. So there's a priority to say, okay, if this thing's going to get in, we're going to have to deal with it. But the other thing that the government's finally starting to do, coming right back to our last conversation about invasive species, about some of the bigger ones, is we've got to keep these populations resilient. We've got to get them high. And that means dealing with foxes and cats and rats on islands where you've got huge, nesting areas of birds, so that, that population on that island is 100,000 rather than 80,000, or 10,000 rather than 2,000.
And there's
when it turns
spectacular successes when we've done that. Like I know that Lord Howe Island, they've gotten rid of the rats there,
Yep.
and they've just had an explosion in bird populations. And Macquarie Island is another one. We're getting rid of rats in particular, who are getting down in the burrows and eating eggs. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh,
That
look,
works.
and the island eradications is the big conservation success story in Australia. It's the big good news story that says we know what is needed, and we can do it, and it will have transformative impacts. Actually, the Lord Howe Island woodhen, which were on the brink of extinction. I was in Lord Howe last year or the year before, and the locals are now complaining because there's so many of them that they have to slow their cars down driving around the island because they're just constant. They're basically everywhere. So you've got this complete transformation of an ecosystem. Palms that were never seeding because the rats would eat all the seeds, all coming back and taking over areas of the island that had essentially been just weeds. So there's getting rid of invasive species on islands is something that we can do. One of the issues,
because like the capacity of nature to bounce back is incredible. I had a friend who was a marine biologist, and he went to the island of Krakatoa it's called Anak Krakatoa, baby Krakatoa, or son of Krakatoa, and it was the gigantic volcanic island that blew up. I think it's the biggest explosion ever recorded in human history in like 1880. This gigantic volcanic explosion. Whole island disappears, tsunami, hundreds of thousands killed, all the rest, and like essentially just 3 little bits of the island were left. Then 100 years later, he's a marine biologist. He goes back to this island, and it's just covered in like the island's regrown, the volcano's still there, and it's just covered in jungle that's got like hundreds of species of birds, full biodiversity, like including like monkeys and everything. And no one's put anything back. It's just like life.
But I feel like you're describing the plot of Moana.
Yeah. Am I?
It's
Okay.
basically-
Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just getting
I remember I remember when Google Earth first came out, and I would be good to go do it. I remember I used to love going over to Mount St. Helens in the US on Google Earth, and just seeing that just completely devastated landscape where it's just basically grey.
the moon.
Yeah, it's like just the moon after this. I have no idea what the recovery there's like.
I think it's pretty good. I love those photos of Mount St. Helens exploding. There was one guy who was like on an opposing, he was with, I think, the US Geological Survey, and he was like, oh, there's something going on, and they sent him up to a mountain, and there's 5 photos that he took before he died.
Yeah.
Literally, and he's just facing Mount St. Helens as just gigatons of earth just explodes into space right at him. I mean, I love volcanoes, man. I've always travelled the world.
Have you seen that? What's that Netflix one that they've got that's like is it Life on Earth on Netflix, where they used all the CGI that they developed in the Jurassic Park movies to basically do like a David Attenborough documentary, but as if it was like taking you through when the comet hits hits the
Oh, yeah,
dinosaurs and just
yes.
like as if you're actually there.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
love that one.
The speed.
Life on
of-
this planet or
yeah,
something?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. The speed
Oh.
of the blast
Yeah,
wave.
yeah, yeah. And just
It's
say,
going
like-
at like 1,000 miles an hour, and
Oh.
it's like, oh my god.
Imagine
yeah.
that.
Hey, Pete. We'll have to get a volcanologist on. Let's talk about volcanoes.
Yeah.
I love talking about volcanoes
And earthquakes.
and earthquakes.
Yeah. The Newcastle earthquake.
Oh, that's right.
The tremor.
It's going to be it's a big issue in Australia now with us building nuclear reactors on earthquakes. But I digress. Rock snot. Let's talk about rock snot. Let's talk about some of the, because like what you're talking with bird flu, you're talking about a virus,
Yes.
and we don't like. I don't think science actually knows if viruses or is viruses, viri, whatever they are actually living things. But they're sort of like a separate form of life, aren't they? But anyway, they're real. They're in birds. They're coming. What else is small and nasty and coming for us?
So,
Rock snot. Tell us about rock snot. What's that?
yeah, so Dr. Carol Booth, who does a lot of our policy work, she did for the Sydney Morning Herald a sort of, the 10 things that keep me up at night. And rock snot was on that list if they turn up. And essentially, as I said, imagine rocks, river systems covered in snot. This thing is just like, like an algae that you pick up. It's just like takes over whole areas. And this is what invasive species do. They very quickly take over areas. They adapt. They don't have predators. They don't have the natural things that stop them. And so, in Queensland, in the Brisbane River, for example, last year they found these Asian gold clams, which you see some of the images from overseas from where they've turned up. And this is now there in Brisbane River. And they basically can take over just entire river systems just covered in these clams. They can clog up dams, and so rock snot is another example of this. And it's one of
Where did rock snot come from?
I don't know the details on rock snot's background, sorry.
Yeah. What about golden clams? They've just come on.
Sorry. Where are they going to... We don't have rock snot, so sorry.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
right.
sorry. I think you're saying where in the world is it from?
But globally, rock snot's a thing.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And these things come... mainly shipping.
Yeah.
This is the main
The
way.
bilges of boats and stuff like that. They pump out.
Yeah, bilge water, on the barnacles that are on boats, in container ships, cars traveling, they're often small, and it takes, constant vigilance.
And we're freighting like fruit and vegetables all over the world. You're like in refrigeration,
Exactly.
and snakes and spiders and all these things just turn up and they just go, yeah, hey, I'm here and I'm like acclimatized.
Yeah, and look, Australia is, probably the best place in the world at dealing with these things. It's just we're also one of the most vulnerable places to it, and we've got the best opportunities to stop it coming in. We're an island. We control our borders, unlike most countries don't control their borders in terms of the flow of goods and services and people. Yeah,
fumigating and all that.
Fire ants turned up in Italy last year, I think, or might have been the year before, and basically Europe went, like, we can't do anything about this because they just don't have the ability to control borders or do anything in a way that allows them to have that sort of biosecurity response. Luckily a lot of Europe's cold, so it's not going to be as bad as it is for Australia, but it is this advantage that we have if it's keeping out the rosy predator snails and the murder hornets and these things that Carol talks about keeping her up at night. But there's other things as well that are already here that we worry about, and we call them the sleeper pests. So one that is a huge problem in New Zealand but is not yet a problem in Australia, are ferrets.
Ferrets, man.
I know, and people keep ferrets as pet. You go to Newtown, you will see people walking. I saw it in Wollongong recently. Someone walking down the street with a ferret on a lead. People take ferrets to go rabbit hunting, for example. And one of the issues with invasive species is they can take 100 years before they suddenly have the right conditions where they just explode into the environment. And in New Zealand, ferrets are they're like foxes over here. They don't have foxes in New Zealand. They've got ferrets. And this is something that could be an issue. We don't need to keep ferrets as pets in Australia. We've got enough other things we could keep. But making that decision's been really difficult for governments. And so, that's a threat. Another problem we have is the increasing trade of products through the internet. So, for example, aquarium fish or aquarium weeds, aquatic weeds. So people increasingly want to have these beautiful, aquariums, and they bring things in like Amazon frogbit, for example, which is this sort of fleshy, round pondweed that looks wonderful on top of your fish tank, but you have to clean it out pretty often because it grows so fast. And then the people who clean it out, it's illegal in every state except Queensland, where we're doing some work on that. But people get it delivered through the internet, stick a couple of leaves in the top spreads, you clean it out, and then what do you do when you clean it out?
Throw it down the back,
throw it down the back, throw it down the drain, and then it starts to get into areas, and it completely can take over. So you see these images, particularly in northern Australia, of whole river systems completely green with Amazon frogbit, and that's turning up because people are bringing these things. And there's, I think there's over 30,000 different plants traded in Australia.
It's the classic, isn't it? The budgie smuggler. Like there's a massive trade, illegal trade in animals, plants, globally. Look, I'd like to talk
often
about
associated with the drug trade.
The drug trade. But before we get into the weeds, can we just talk about, because you were talking about ferrets, before we get off animals and into weeds, cats.
Oh, cats.
Cats have been devastating in Australia. There's no two ways about it. And there's a lot of resistance to controlling them. Before we get into like the proper, discussion, are giant feral pumas and panthers operating cougars, mountain lions in Australia? Because there's a lot of shit on the internet. There's a lot of talk on the internet that gold miners from the States in the 1850s brought mountain lions. There's the Penrith Panthers, a football team named after Penrith Panthers. Are they real? Put it on the record. Do we have feral panthers running wild in the west of the state?
Doubtful.
Doubtful?
Doubtful.
Possible?
Highly unlikely. You'd need probably more than two for them to survive more than the life of that one species. B, it wouldn't be that difficult with the number of people who've got camera traps, the number of people who've got dashboard cams to get definitive images.
One would just end up dead on the highway.
Exactly, and that's the thing. They would turn up dead. We'd see bodies. So it's a nice urban myth. But we do have pretty large feral cats. They cause incredible, devastation. Like we're talking billions of native animals killed every year by cats. Billions.
They just eat lizards, birds, frogs, everything. Yeah. They're like an omnivore. They're like, and they, they're an equal opportunity predator. They're getting big. Like up on my farm, I've seen one up there that must have been
panther.
Yeah, well, it looked like a panther, but it was white.
Yeah.
And
white lion.
Yeah, it looked like it was probably, like 2.5 feet long. It was big, white, and it was staunch, and it was walking through the grass. My dog ran down and went up and went to like attack it. Ran down and it fought off my dog, which is like a tough Australian cattle dog. It turned around and just went, Reow! I remember the cat of Footrot Flat's horse. That cat, just this tough hombre. But seriously, like a cat's the worst of the worst.
For those who don't know, lots of Jeremy's conversations come back to Footrot Flat.
It's pretty seminal for me, yeah. But but it's true that these cats are out. They're acclimatized. They're super.
Look, other than
effective predators.
Rabbits, cats. These are the big drivers of extinctions and animals being pushed to the brink of extinction. I don't think anyone finds it surprising in the same way that with those big feral herbivores, a lot of people don't really understand how they cause damage. Cats are incredible hunters. They're incredible killers. They are, as you say, equal opportunity killers. They get into nest boxes. They make sure that we don't have those blue-tongued lizards living under our doorsteps. They are particularly problematic in the more arid, semi-arid and open environments. And so that's why they're a real problem in our cities, where they're a lot more open. So foxes tend to be a greater problem in forested areas. Cats aren't as big a deal in more forested areas, but in open areas, that's why they have such a big, devastating impact on northern Australia and in our suburban landscapes as well, and in sort of farmland landscapes, because they are so good in those open environments as predators, as killers, hunters, and harassers of animals as well. So, in the next 24 hours, there will be 8 million native animals killed by roaming, hunting, feral cats and pet cats. Massive, massive impact. And we know that we can't eradicate those feral cats. I mean, there may be biological solutions, but they're going to be coming up against a pretty strong group of people who are, worried about the impacts on pet cats. But we can reduce their numbers in around particular threatened species populations on islands. There's been a lot of work done. The biggest island, Dirk Hartog, off Western Australia, they've eradicated cats. There's work being done now to eradicate them from Kangaroo Island off South Australia. Consideration of other areas where we could get on top. French Island off Melbourne, down in Victoria. But yeah, they are an incredible problem, and unfortunately, there are more pet cats than feral cats, and while each pet cat kills about a quarter as many native animals as a feral cat, because we keep the populations artificially high, we feed them and then let them out, the impact per square kilometre in our suburbs is about 30 to 50 times higher on native animals than it is out in the bush. And so they really are one of the main things sending our suburbs silent in terms of birds and lizards and frogs, insects as well.
So what do we do about it? Because I know there's some campaigns to deal with it. What do we do about it? And what sort of who's resisting? Well,
the first thing is we need a cultural change on keeping cats safe at home. 50 years ago in Australia, there were a lot more roaming dogs. If you go over to many countries in the world, you will see dogs roaming the streets. We changed our culture and our expectations on dog ownership so that people keep them under control, on a leash. They don't let them out there roaming, harassing people, harassing wildlife. But we haven't had that change with cats. They seem to be a bit of a special category, that it's okay to let them out and roaming. Cats that are kept safe at home tend to live about 10 years longer than cats that are out roaming, and that's because they don't get into fights. Diseases like toxoplasmosis don't affect them. They don't get run over. So they don't get injured. They live a lot longer and actually happier. But I think there's a few things going on there. In New South Wales and WA, there's this weird situation where councils can't actually bring in cat containment rules. So we don't have the sort of rule at the top that then allows the cultural change to occur. So it's a bit like expecting people to all wear seatbelts without, and not run red lights just by having education campaigns. Doesn't work without a rule. But the rule's not going to be the only thing that changes people's behaviour. So we need that change. We need local councils to be empowered in New South Wales and WA. We need increasing numbers of councils to bring in those rules. Education, pet registration, desexing. There's a whole ecosystem of things that we need, but right at the top, there needs to be clear rules that say if you've got a pet cat, you also have a responsibility to keep that cat safe at home, under control, not out killing our wildlife. Owning a pet in Australia really is a right. Everyone sort of gets to own a pet, but it has to come with some responsibilities. And one of them has to be not letting your cat be out there stalking, hunting, harassing, killing wildlife.
Because I've seen in places like those islands where they've gotten rid of cats, they've eradicated the cats, or there's a few sort of wildlife groups that have effectively fenced off an area, cat-proof fence and the whole thing. it totally works.
Oh, look,
It-
dunnets and bilbies and bettongs
All
and all
those
coming
small
back.
mammals come
even
back.
quolls, like,
Yeah, all
which
of
are
those
a
things
native
come
predator.
back. Yeah. Yeah, which is super fascinating. What's your view on, like, when it comes to cat ownership, like cat ownership, dog ownership? What's your view on, like, owning native animals? Like, we're allowed to keep birds. I think in Australia we're allowed to keep like a cockatoo and budgerigars and these sort of things, but we're not allowed to have like wombats, which I think can be domesticated as pets. Would we be better off having pet wombats than cats?
I must say it's not something I've done a whole heap of thinking about.
Because I knew, like, in Tasmania, I went to a pub
Yeah.
and it was famous. It was up on the central. It was like a fishing pub up on the.
It's like
this
my
central,
grandma lives in Gula Gulch. Like that.
I don't know about that one, mate. But it was called the Complete Angler, and they had a pet wombat in there, and it was called Susie. We'd be playing computer games, old tabletop computer games, and Susie would come running through the pub, bash into people, and would like want chips. It was pretty fat. It was probably like overeating. It's probably like Sandboy chips or something. Vinegar chips aren't probably good for a wombat. But it was totally domestic. It slept out the back of the pub, cruised through, slept by the fire, did these nice, really like cubed grass shits that were really easy to deal with, all the rest. Like, wouldn't we be better off with a pet quoll, with a pet wombat than pet cats? Controversy corner, over to you.
I'll probably have to take a pass only because I haven't thought heaps about whether, the ethics of there are issues with the ethics of keeping pets full stop. A huge number of people keep pets in really great conditions. A lot of people keep pets in really awful conditions. I do think, I've always found it interesting, the opposition to kangaroo meat as a sort of healthy, sustainable option to eating other meat sources. The way I see some of the campaigning against that seems to be as if the kangaroos, more deserving of life than the cows or the sheep that we eat already. I find that a bit weird. So I've never had a problem with us people deciding to farm kangaroos instead of farming sheep, and it's probably significantly less environmental impact having those.
Because there was there's been a real pushback against farming like kangaroos, or harvesting. I'd put it like managing populations of kangaroos, and also like emu. There was I think like 30 years ago there was like a real push for emu farming.
Oils from the
all of that, but it's all gone by. There's a big campaign, especially in the States, against like kangaroo leather, kangaroo harvesting, as if that like the eastern grey kangaroo I don't think is an endangered species.
No, and in fact, in lots of circumstances, it's really that they are what's called overabundant native populations. That is, that there are such.
We've altered the landscape
exactly.
so into like grains and grasses where it would have been forest and a smaller population, and then there's these massive
and
spikes
you
and troughs.
Significant decline in native grasslands because of the overabundant kangaroo populations. I know a lot of the wildlife conservancies, one of the things they have to manage is kangaroo populations. In the ACT, there's been a lot of controversy about their management of kangaroo populations because of their impacts. A good example of those sort of overabundant native populations is on King Island, which people maybe heard of, King Island Dairy, off Tasmania. And just last year, those dune systems of King Island were the federal government under federal environment law listed them as what's called a critically endangered ecological community, which means basically it's a group of plants and animals that live together in a particular area that is dying out really quickly. And what's happened? I mean, the dairy farming stripped a lot of the overstory vegetation off the dune systems there, and then and so those dunes are basically starting to blow away in the wind. But the reason that they're not revegetating is partly because of overabundant paddy melons. And there was an attempt by governments to start to control those paddy melons to protect this critically endangered ecological community. And then there was a campaign against Woolworths to get them to stop stocking King Island dairy. And they basically just went, we're just going to let those dune systems blow away because people don't want to see some native species being killed. So
it's always complex.
I find it, yeah.
It's complex, and it's not a two-way street. I saw recently that wallabies are a pest species, like small, like kangaroos. Wallabies are a pest species in the UK.
Oh,
they're wild in the UK. And like Australian plants, like, we can't feel like just like the victim here. We're like, we've got all these nasties that have come from other places, like the wrong place, the wrong thing in the wrong place. But we've got some pretty wild. In actual fact, I think Australian plants are really bad. Australian eucalypts, like we see California burning, wattles, eucalypts. But the UK, I think it's got like it's dealing with wallaby outbreaks, which I think is hilarious, but probably not for them. And kookaburras.
Oh yeah,
like our iconic Australian sort of predator bird over in the UK.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, things come to here. They're invasive. Our things. I know my colleague sent me a photo recently. She was in South Africa, in I think the Cape Town Botanic Gardens. They have an entire garden that's like the South African plants that have basically fucked up the world. So, wait, do you want me to re-say that?
No, it's okay.
It's okay. Yeah, and it's basically this like garden of like the species that have just gone out there, things like agapanthus that we all love that are now taking over bits of the Blue Mountains. And so definitely. And look, the fact that we are a southern continent that's been isolated with these really different species. Of course, our species, some of them are going to take off overseas just in the same way that others are going to take off here because they won't have those same predators and relationships with viruses and insects. And look, Australia is a pretty fire-prone continent because of the nature of eucalypts. You've got that, the oils in the gum leaves that are essentially assist in sending fires further away because those oils explode, send more sparks further distance, and you get significant fire regimes. So when eucalypts get out across the world, they are altering fire regimes overseas. It's not just an Australian problem.
Yeah, so eucalypts are pervasive. They've spread. I think there's like hundreds of types of eucalypts in Australia. But when they get out of Australia, like they have in the States, they can be a huge problem. Like part of the Californian wildfires, the problems there is an invasive species. It's this plant that's gotten to this arid area of California and said, I'm right at home here. It's spread and it's having a massive impact on the environment, the economy over there.
Look, and I understand it's also changing fire regimes in China, for example, because, these are fire-adapted species that have also proved to be incredibly good invasive species overseas and then entirely transforming ecosystems. And it's why, I come back to that bit I said earlier, which is we are in a unique position in Australia. We're an island continent. We are globally significant in terms of biodiversity, but we also are in this position where we can do something about invasives. They are going to impact us more, and we have better opportunities to stop them. If you're in, the US and they're pretty laissez-faire, they're sort of anything goes. Similarly Europe with sort of porous borders, then it becomes very difficult to stop these things coming in, spreading. I
know in the Everglades, like you see the shows, they're trying to deal with the Burmese pythons and the anacondas, and they're turning to super snakes.
And I think most years in Australia, there are some those sort of anacondas and pythons found and destroyed because we could be like Florida in northern Australia.
Yeah, imagine those in Kakadu.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, imagine those. And, like, in the States, they're just turning into, like, they're, like, 7 meters long and, you know, they've got a bounty on them, but there's just no chance of them putting that genie back in the bottle. And I wanted to talk a little bit about weeds. We're into the weeds.
Let's get right in.
Let's get into weeds, mate. Because, like, in Australia, I know that cannabis was effectively like like hemp. You know, cannabis spread through the Hunter Valley. They had to come out with an eradication program in the 1970s because people were going up there and harvesting and, you know, smoking, you know, a couple of pounds of it and getting no effect. But in Australia, globally, weeds are a big deal. Like, talk to us a little bit about that. Like, we've had camphor laurels, and I think they can trace camphor laurels to like one plant, one tree that was brought in from Asia and planted as like an ornamental.
The vast majority of our weeds have come from people's gardens.
People's gardens, they're ornamental. People go to a nursery, they go and plant something out. Because like lantana, I think is from the Caribbean, and it's like a small pot plant there. Oh. But in Australia, lantana?
I think they were planting lantana up the around the train stations up through northern Sydney. You know, like it was a pretty well-known ornamental. You know, it definitely stinks. So I'm not quite sure why people were, but it's got a pretty nice inflorescence. That little small flower with loads of little flowers. But it proved in Australia really capable of spreading quickly, taking over, and what happens with weeds is that they start to make everywhere look the same. You know, you get to parts of the north coast, you get to parts of the south coast, and see whole hillsides, and they're the same lantana plant that's just taken over, or beetle bush down on the coast, or river systems that are being choked with willows and camphor laurels, and basically take over and become these sort of monocultures. There's some interesting things that lantana has done as well. There's a process on the north coast of New South Wales in some of the forests up there they call bell miner dieback. I don't know. So the bell miners, these little birds that essentially farm aphids, and those aphids then kill some of the eucalyptus species. And they found that since lantana's got in and taken over the understory of some of those forests, the bell miner, the little miner bird, is now able to survive and thrive a lot better. So suddenly you're getting a huge number, basically an imbalance of that species that's then breeding, and the aphids, the tiny little insects, are they insects or arachnids? I don't know. Anyway, small invertebrates that are killing the eucalypts. And so you go to areas on the north coast, up your way and further up into the border ranges where you just see dead standing trees with lantana underneath, essentially. But I'll take you for a serious weed that a lot of people probably haven't thought about or know about, which is, one of the worst for us. Take you back to Kakadu, which you were saying before, gamba grass.
So Kakadu, it's a huge Australian wetland up in the Northern Territory, vast area, incredibly
World Heritage
listed wetland, incredibly diverse, beautiful place.
Oh yeah, one of the global environmental gems, but that whole sort of northern Australia. And there's a weed, gamba grass, which is a grass that actually was spread because people were feeding it to cattle. They saw it as a potential food crop, and has been spreading in a lot of sort of out from Darwin, the northern Australian city, and down into some of the national parks and things there. And that is an ecosystem transformer. And what it essentially does is these grasses can get 5 to 7 meters tall, and we don't have elephants in Australia. And so there's nothing really controlling them. And what they do is they take over the grasslands there, these gamba grass, and then when fires come through, because they're so tall, what it means is the fires are instantly at the height of the canopy. And so it turns the woodlands into grasslands. Essentially, it's turning, northern Australian woodlands into the African savanna.
Because the fire goes through, hits hits
Straight
the
up.
canopy, and that then kills the
trees.
Kills the trees because they're low woodland trees, rather than burning slowly along the ground and just
Yeah, and so-
regenerating the grasslands and the bushes. You get the trees knocked out.
Yeah, and basically it's transforming it into like the African plains, but we don't have elephants that are controlling these grasses in Australia, and yeah, totally changed fire regimes and massive carbon emissions associated with them.
Do we bring in elephants? Is that the solution?
No, that is not the solution. That's the solution there may have been in the past, but really it's I mean. One of the things I often say to politicians is there really aren't many strokes of the pen that are going to make a difference on invasive species. It's investment, it's money, it's boots on the ground, it's eyes in the field, it's research into new control techniques.
Research, because things work. Like we know with rabbits, they developed a virus, myxomatosis.
And then Khaleesi.
And that, I remember as a kid in Tasmania, you'd look out and there'd be a rabbit up in the orchard and it'd be like staggering around, and it was like it had myxomatosis. They'd had a program of releasing it, and this poor rabbit with all gummed up eyes would come out, and you'd have to go out and donk it on the head with a shovel and bury it and all the rest. But there have been some successes.
Similarly with the prickly pear?
Prickly pear, I was going to get onto that because I've seen video from, again, like 100 years ago, 1920s and 30s, and prickly pear, which is that cacti that sort of grows up in big sort of plates, and it just consumed parts of Queensland and Western New South Wales and Victoria, that sort of semi-arid grassland area. It was everywhere. It was a huge cost to the environment and agricultural productivity, but now you basically don't see it. How did we deal with it?
Yeah, and look, if you go to a Guzman and Gomez, you'll see them planting it out the front of it now.
I know, yeah.
Because, so it's, look,
you can make a really strong hallucinogen out of the fruit. Prickly pear wine. Yeah, not for anyone, for those playing at home, don't do it without the proper instructions. But there's a Italian guy I knew who made this wine out of prickly pear wine, and it was like, woo!
Yeah, well, and look, there's a biocontrol program that we established that essentially meant that you get that significant reduction in the growth rate of that species, and then suddenly it starts to come into balance a lot more. So we know that biocontrol is with a lot of these established invasive species is really one of the things that we need to develop. But unfortunately, the funding pipeline for biocontrol hasn't been taken seriously by the federal government. There was people are going to start talking a lot about rabbits in the next few years. That's my prediction for you. I mean, they already are. We've had a couple of really good seasons. Numbers are going up big time, but there hasn't been a new release of a Khaleesi virus or another virus since, I think the K5 version was released in 2014. I think it was accidentally released, maybe accidentally on purpose, but released then, and so there hasn't been a new virus, and these viruses lose efficacy after about 10 years.
Yeah, because like any virus will kill like 99.95% of the population, or even if it's working well, but that 0.05 of the population isn't affected. It breeds back up,
and certainly those viruses are nowhere near that sort of level of efficacy. I mean, people may have heard, because Barnaby Joyce did a lot of talking about it, that there's a herpes virus that's been developed for dealing with carp. So that's like goldfish essentially, but the massive ones that are, I can't remember what it is. There's something like 70% of the biomass in the Murray-Darling Basin is carp. Like
they're
it's just
a huge problem. They they outcompete other fish.
Yeah.
They
make you throw up when you pick them up out of the water.
Yeah, they're the most awful creatures. You can't eat them. No. You can't eat them. They're absolutely disgusting. And I think their feeding sort of behaviour is that they basically erode riverbanks.
Exactly, like
so
that.
They go in
super sort of aggressive feeding behaviour that just splashes, and churns up the water, increased turbidity, and erodes the riverbanks. But there's this herpes virus, a carp herpes virus, that there's still consideration of whether they release it. But
I thought they were going to do that, and they haven't done it yet.
no,
They're
I mean,
worried
there's a lot of
they're worried that it might like end up in the apocalypse, like human then moves to humans or some other species or a fish or whatever.
You can imagine post cane toad, there's some pretty serious controls about making sure that if these things are released, that they're not going to be, they're not going to get into native fish, that kind of thing. But one of the other considerations as well has been, when you do release it, it's going to kill a whole heap of carp. That's going to be a whole heap of dead fish. And as we saw when, people have probably seen images of those fish kills in the Murray-Darling Basin, millions of fish all dying at once. You get often what's called a black water event, where basically the oxygen, because of all the bacteria breaking down those dead fish, gets sucked out of the entire river system and kills the whole river system. Everything dies. So if you're going to release it, you sort of have to release it when there's big floods as well, so that all those dead carp start to get washed out to sea. But what I was going to say about that is, I think the efficacy rate of that is expected to be between I think it was between 40 and 80% efficacy. So we're not talking about 100% efficacy, and that'll drop dramatically after 10 years. And so, we can release it. It'll probably then suppress the population. It'll go right down. Initial big deaths. Then the population will probably find an equilibrium at a lower level, because you've got a significant virus out there. But it requires a whole heap of those other programs to then, eradicate them from some of the upper reaches where it suddenly becomes possible. And so similarly with rabbits, we haven't had one for about 10 years. And so that's about the time it takes to start to really lose that efficacy. And 2 years ago in 2023, the rabbit biocontrol pipeline that CSIRO and the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions were doing work on what's the next virus, the funding ended. There's no funding. We're not funding that. There's a weed biocontrol program that ended at the end of last year. There's no funding on the horizon for that either. So this is one of these sort of short-term thinking from governments around budgets, where it's like, hang on, if we get that program back up, it's still going to probably take us 8 to 10 years maybe to develop the next rabbit biocontrol. Maybe we're lucky and we can do it quicker, but it's going to take a significant amount of time. In that time, we're going to start to see rabbit populations booming in a way that I think we haven't for a very long time. And this is going to be a topic of conversation for Australians over the next few years. That's my prediction for you, Jez.
What about other jurisdictions? Like rabbits must be a problem in other areas. Is there other countries in the world that are doing like good work in this, or is it like you said, Australia's pretty good because we've had some disasters, but we've got a capacity to manage it because we're an island. Is there any other jurisdiction that does good work in this, or that has got a similar level of problem?
Rabbits specifically, I'm not aware, and a lot of countries rabbits have been native to, and there's a lot more predators in the landscape as well. So one of the things we know also is that the spread of rabbits was also part of the reason for the spread of foxes as well. They suddenly had this really abundant food source, and they were able to spread out really quickly across the continent as well. I mean, there's a lot of work done, for example, in the Caribbean on some of the islands there in terms of eradications and managing weeds and other predators. New Zealand, certainly, they've got a big campaign in New Zealand to be predator-free by 2050. It's a big, every side of politics are behind it, and there's a real sense of
what do you mean predator-free? Like,
so foxes and ferrets and
the Australian possum there is a huge problem, isn't it? And they've tried to turn that into an industry. Like you get a possum fur jumper, it's like $700.
Yeah.
And it's the most beautiful jumper you'll ever wear in your life. Are they being effective over there?
They're certainly being ambitious, and I think with some of these invasive species, we need to be ambitious. We need to not have our sights set on what is possible right now, but setting some of these big targets. So South Australia have set a target to eradicate all deer within the next 10 years. That's going to be pretty difficult. They've got really good control with aerial shooting going on. They've put money in. But, getting there is not guaranteed. Same with, fire ants. Like that eradication program, it's not certain that we'll be able to eradicate. Like nowhere else in the world has ever eradicated ants at that scale. But the techniques, the tools are improving. We're going in with ambition and scale, and we're starting to see results at scale as well. And I think that I think governments can be more ambitious than they currently are. It's something that I struggle with. I think there's a bit of a sense that often the impacts of invasive species, other than agricultural, aren't easily quantifiable in terms of economics if they're environmental impacts. It's easier to imagine stopping, logging a certain area than it is to imagine, stopping the deer population exploding. And something that it may even be something you said to me, Jeremy, a long while ago, but certainly something that I say regularly is, no one cares about invasive species till everyone cares. And this is a problem we face all the time, is that right now farmers in Western New South Wales, in Coonabarabran, are screaming about pigs.
Yeah.
They don't have a deer problem. In 5 to 10 years, they're going to have a deer problem.
Oh, yeah,
and
I think I did say that, and it was I experienced a mouse plague.
Yes.
I was out in Western Queensland in a mouse plague, and that is a nightmare. I don't know if you've ever been like some people don't like rodents, but when there's 10 of them like scrabbling over your bed at night, I was camping and there were just millions of them everywhere, going up trees, in your car, just eating everything, and it was just insane.
Yeah.
The whole landscape was moving with this mouse plague, and I was like, oh my God, this would like send me bananas. I'm wondering, like, one of the things that I've always been keen on is, is predators, like your apex predator.
Yes.
Humans are, we're a bio-indicator. Well, we aren't really, but, like when you've got great white sharks and wolves, I know like the North American experience, they're great regulators for everything underneath.
Yes.
And humans, typically, we sort of take out that competition, those threats to livestock. Like, is like restoring those high-end predators. Like, in particular, like I think a much maligned in Australia animal is the dingo. Does that really help? Like, if we've got a healthy ecosystem with a healthy number of dingoes, is that going to reduce the number of cats, other feral dogs or wild dogs, deer, that sort of thing? Is that part of the process too?
Look, this is, a deeply controversial area for a number of reasons. One is, as you say, like, human predator interactions are pretty fraught a lot of the time. Whether it's sharks or it's, the reintroduction of wolves in Europe, we're seeing, predators kill things. And what they often kill, if it's sharks, might be humans. If it's, dingoes or mountain lions, coyotes, is livestock. And people if it's tigers in India, it's people, and they want to go and kill all those tigers that a lot of conservationists want to go and keep. So predator human interactions is super fraught for that reason. I think we can acknowledge, and I think the majority of Australians think, dingoes are an iconic Australian species. They are, whether they're native or not is interesting because they were probably introduced by humans a few thousand years ago. So under some definitions, they could be considered an invasive species. Under other definitions, they've been here for a long time. A lot of our native animals have adapted to them in the landscape, but also it wasn't that long ago that Australian mainland had Tasmanian devils and Tasmanian tigers as apex predators, which were then probably hunted out by humans. And
humans with dogs.
Potentially, yeah. And so bringing those predators back or support, I think there is definitely dingoes. There's definitely, they are part of the Australian landscape, and we also know that where there are dingoes, there aren't goats, for example. Dingoes are very effective at reducing a lot of those feral herbivores that we talk about, and they can do it in a couple of ways. A couple of impacts. One of them is that they can, they kill and very quickly reduce the numbers of those herbivores, the plant eaters like goats. The other thing is they move them on. So they're not putting like high pressure on just one area all the time because they've got this pressure. They mean that we don't get things like overabundant kangaroo populations and things. So there is a pretty active debate, I think, among agricultural communities because some, particularly cattle farmers in rangeland areas, actually see a benefit of dingoes. They see less goats destroying their land. They see less overabundant kangaroo populations. And, the National Feral Cat Action Plan that Tanya Plibersek just brought into law at the start of this year, like a few weeks ago, it very clearly says that there is potentially a role for where you've got dingoes in the landscape for actually reducing the number of foxes and cats, and actually foxes and cats have a greater impact on native species than dingoes do. So, but it's called the mesopredator release hypothesis, which is the sort of, it reduces the number of medium-sized predators where you've got bigger predators, and the medium-sized predators have a bigger impact on the really small mammals that we have. There's a bit of debate in the scientific literature, but what is not debated is that where you've got dingoes, you have significantly less feral herbivores, just as you have dingoes impacting on sheep farming. Like it's pretty easy correlation. So I think that, we need to find a way to live with dingoes in the landscape, that just persecuting them, we know that the evidence is that the majority of what is considered wild dogs, nearly all of them are actually dingoes. There aren't really parts of north coast of New South Wales, potentially, but in most instances, domestic dogs aren't surviving out there. It's not like people are letting their dogs go and they're surviving. These are dingoes mainly out there. There's a fallacy that dingoes are all, yellow coloured coats. There's black dingoes, there's grey dingoes, there's a whole heap of different colours.
They live in forests too.
They live
A lot
in forests,
of
they live in the alpine areas.
They think that they're, in the semi-arid desert environments, but they definitely can be.
But I think, like, for me, it's a bit like the cats and people keeping cats at home. We're not going to solve these issues by a government coming in and just making a decision. Dingoes are all protected now. You can't, cats aren't allowed outside. We need some of those decisions from government, but actually what's needed is a cultural change. We need to work out how can livestock farming and dingoes coexist. What is needed in terms of guardian dogs? What are the appropriate livestock to be in certain areas? Do we need to have a greater transition away from sheep into cattle in certain areas to maintain dingo populations? But I think, and I've seen pretty clear polling as well, the majority of Australians recognise dingoes as native, want them protected, see them as an iconic species, and just killing them doesn't do good things for our management of other invasive species, and is also, I think not something that most Australians want to accept.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, I think we accept in Australia, we got a lot of bitey things, like funnel web spiders, great white sharks, like, taipan snakes. It's part of our environment. I know that on Fraser Island, that, occasionally, it's not all the time, but occasionally people are attacked, and I think people have been killed by dingoes on Fraser Island. But I think people acknowledge that that's what you get when you go to those places. That's the environment you're in. If you're going to go, like swimming off Hinchinbrook Island, you might get eaten by a tiger shark or a crocodile or stung by an irukandji or something like that. There's a risk involved. And I think that people accept that. And I really don't see a big pushback like, so with shark attacks. There doesn't seem to be a big pushback. There's been some emerge more recently on, cull the great white sharks. Now their numbers are back. But I think people recognise that a healthy, diverse ecosystem comes with risk. You know, it comes with the potential that, you know, that there might be something out there that could potentially do you harm, but we're much better off having a vibrant and healthy ecosystem than not, which is a fantastic note to finish off on, Jack. I really appreciate you coming in. Super fascinating to hear the work you're doing, you know, like helping to manage the continent of Australia and deal with the risk to the economy, to our ecology and the rest. And we often think that, you know, the apocalypse is going to come from alien invaders, but coming from another galaxy, but it might just be on a, you know, on a freighter from Xiamen and with, you know, with, what was it? Rock snot, toxic rock snot,
Exactly.
or bird flu.
Yeah.
I mean, if you make a list of all the things that are threatening Australia and anywhere around the world in terms of invasive species, it's huge. The impacts are massive on the way we live, how we live, and our economy. So more strength to your arm, brother, and thanks for coming on.
Always happy, Jez, and I'll just say, you know, massive thank you for all your advocacy on the issue. I think people probably don't realise that not only were you a big push behind making sure that hemp could be grown in New South Wales, also making sure that deer are recognised as a feral animal in New South Wales, and that's always going to be a legacy that you've created. So thank you.
Thanks, mate. Good on you.